Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you might be. My name is Rick Kennedy, and for about 30 years, I was the manager of media relations at GE Aviation, recently retired, and have been buried in the history of our company, producing the centennial book on the history of this amazing company, GE Aviation. It's appropriate because our culture is now a century in the making, and our business is a story told over and over again, taking huge bets on technologies that could rattle the entire operation, but instead advance the cause of aviation. Every new technology we pursue never goes smoothly at the beginning. This is because our greatest achievements are always against our greatest headwinds. But we're propelled by leaders who inspire creativity, trust, courage, and inclusiveness. Now, I didn't come here to be your bearded pensioner cheerleader, but if you have delved in this history as long as I have, and have studied or literally worked with the great leaders of this business, including many people in this room, it's impossible not to become one. Now, earlier I mentioned the word inclusiveness. I have a simple message for those of you who were born outside the United States, and this is an important fact. For 33 years, from 1961 to 1993, a period in which GE Aviation became the world leader in jet propulsion, this business was run by leaders that were not born or raised in the United States. Gerhard Neumann was a German Jew who had to escape Nazi Germany and served as a mechanic with the Flying Tigers in China, and his service to the United States was so courageous that he was awarded his citizenship through a special act of Congress in 1946. He led the business for 18 years, succeeded by Brian Rowe, a British engineer who was a young apprentice, worked on the very first commercial transport passenger jetliner called the de Havilland Comet. And Brian built a small part he invented for the engine he was very proud of. Now, Gerhard Neumann and Brian Rowe weren't really necessarily the best of friends, but they thought exactly alike when it came to shaping this culture and in winning. About 10 years ago, our company set forth to decide what is the true essence of GE Aviation, and from that comes our purpose statement. We invent the future of flight, we lift people up, and we bring them home safely. But in reality, this purpose statement was created for us a long, long time ago. First in Lynn, Massachusetts, then you add Evendale, Ohio, and now you can add more than 80 sites around the world. So let's take a few minutes to look at some of our heroes, people who lived this purpose statement and shaped who we are today. The great thing about GE Aviation is we actually have a father, and this is his hall. Sanford Moss brought GE into the aviation world, even though he was terrified of flying himself. He would do anything he could to avoid flying in an airplane. But just like many of you in this room, he was fascinated by anything mechanical. He used to tell his engineers, we should all want to take our watches out and take them apart just to understand the inner workings. He received a doctorate degree in mechanical engineering from Cornell in 1903. You see our dashing looking Sambor to the far left. And he was the first American and perhaps the first person in the world to run an actual gas turbine using combustion gas to power a turbine. He joins the Lynn operation in Lynn, Massachusetts of GE, a huge steam engine operation. He gets involved in compression, compressors, impellers, and even runs a gas turbine research group for a short period of time. And like so many people of his generation, his life would change with the onset of World War I. This was our first aviation war. And aircraft were not only used for dogfights, but they were used for reconnaissance. But that was a challenge. You had to fly at high altitude, and we know what happens to piston engines at high altitude. The oxygen is thin, and they struggle maintaining power. Hence the invention of the turbo supercharger, first introduced by the French. In fact, when the Americans joined the war effort in 1917, they acquired several of these unique turbocharger devices from the French, but struggled during the test of them, so they turned to General Electric. General Electric had expertise in impellers, they had expertise in turbine wheels. They were a perfect company to engage in developing this device that would capture the exhaust gas of a turbine engine and compress that air and bring it back into the turbine, back into the piston engine. This is what Sanford Moss would describe a turbo supercharger as tricking an engine to thinking that's flying at sea level. But Sanford Moss was the real key to the whole reason they turned to GE. William Duran, who ran the National Advisory of Aeronautics for the United States, that was the precursor of NASA, he remembered Sanford Moss. He was a professor at Cornell. And below his office, there was a young Sanford Moss running his experiments on a gas turbine. Sanford Moss takes an initial design, and as we remember, we all know in our history, it goes to Pikes Peak in Colorado. Why? Because at 14,000 feet, he could simulate the altitude of an aircraft. The tests were successful, we get an Army contract, but the war ends and we're out of luck. We were practically out of the business of aviation before we could even get in. But in 1919 at McCook Field in Dayton, Ohio, where the U.S. Air Army Corps was running its experiments in aviation, we are re-awarded a contract for turbo superchargers. And if you look on the bottom center, you will see the first flight on July 12th of 1919, when we took a GE turbo supercharger attached to a Liberty engine and flew for the first time. And our impact on aviation was immediate. We could sustain power with no difficulty at 16,000 feet. And over the course of the next 2 to 3 months, we were breaking altitude records practically every week. If you look in the lower right, you'll see one of the newspaper articles. There were many. We'd run all over the world when there was a fun competition between the United States and France over who could fly higher. But as I said before, our great accomplishments occurred during our greatest headwinds. And Sanford Moss had his share in the mid-1920s because the interest in high altitude flying declined. This was the era of barnstormers and Charles Lindbergh, and there was no interest in flying above the clouds. You know, we hadn't come to the point yet where we had an airline industry. And so Sanford Moss's small team in Lynn survived by being a subcontractor to Pratt & Whitney and to Wright Aeronautical, providing super turbochargers, or they would call them turbochargers, for the internal component inside a piston engine. This would all change for Sanford Moss and the Lynn team in the mid-1930s with the Boeing 299 you see in the top center. This is the prototype for the B-17 aircraft that would blanket the skies of Europe during World War II. And by 1943, GE had 100,000 turbo superchargers in the skies, protecting the altitude, heights, and operations of Allied aircraft. And this expertise would then lead us to be invited by the U.S. Army to develop America's first jet engine based on the Whittle design. When Sanford Moss died shortly after World War II, there were newspaper articles all over the country declaring him as a man whose technology, invented more than 20 years before, had influenced the outcome of a war. This man, Sanford Moss, who was afraid of flying, would set the stage for GE to have great accomplishments in the world of aviation. We also lift people up, and no one did it better than John Blanton. If you're from Purdue University, you are looking at the 1943 billiards champion of Purdue University. John Blanton grew up in segregated Louisville. He obtains a mechanical engineering degree from Purdue and then works for Bell Aircraft for several years before joining GE in Cincinnati in 1956 in advanced technology and engineering. At this time, GE was working on a program called the J-93. It was an engine for a Mach 3 bomber for the U.S. Air Force called the XB-70. And John Blanton then was entrusted in 1961 with a program called the X-370 because the Air Force said, we think we should develop an engine for 3.5 Mach. Now, John Blanton is leading this technology program entrusted by the U.S. Air Force to GE at the time of tremendous civil unrest in this city and across the country. Imagine a guy leading a technical team at GE at the very same time his son, a future doctor, couldn't even swim at Cincinnati's Coney Island. Now, the photo in the middle is Avondale. This is a neighborhood where John and his family moved in 1962. 6 years later, it's the site of one of the most violent race riots in the United States. And this would inform John's purpose in life. In the 1970s, he would lead technology programs with GE, but at the same time became a very, very involved civic leader. He was on the council that ran the Queen City Metro Bus Company. Now, why would he do that? He understood the economic lifeline for many working poor who couldn't afford cars was a viable bus system. But John goes way beyond just the bus system. John led the Urban League. John was on the board of the Cincinnati Zoo. John led his own African-American chapter of the Boy Scouts. John was in charge of the Cincinnati Scholarship Fund. He led the Alliance for Christians and Jews in the city. And when he died in 2003, as you'll see on the far right, the city heralded him for all of his acts, both succeeding at GE, but also for what he did in the city. If you read through that content, you'll see the purpose statement all over. And this is because we didn't have a purpose statement back when John was working at GE. He didn't need one because he lived it. Now, I mentioned before about how we bring people home safely. No one did that better than Gerhard Neumann, who we see in the middle of this chart. Gerhard Neumann, and excuse me for this American colloquialism, not only brought people home safely, but at GE, he brought home the bacon. Now, when we come into our learning center, there's several engines in the museum in the front that we should all stop and genuflect in front of because of what they meant to this business. And we'll talk about a couple more here in this talk. But there's a very large engine in the front called the TF-39. And a year ago, when Gary Mercer and I took Ian Whittle on a tour of the museum, Ian Whittle being the son of Frank Whittle, the inventor of the jet engine and a pilot himself, he stops in his tracks, looks straight up to the TF-39 and says, now that is an important engine. And he is right. It was introduced in 1965, but talk about headwinds. Let's think about the climate that GE was facing at that time. In 1961, Gerhard Neumann takes over this business. Pratt & Whitney has more than 80% of the commercial business, airline business in this country. We had our first entry into the airline business with the CJ805. It was losing more and more money every week. It was a complete financial and technical embarrassment to the company. We were involved in lift fan technology, putting lift fans in the wings of Orion aircraft so it could take off vertically. Great technology. It never became a production program in this country. We were also involved in the XB-70 I mentioned earlier, the J-93 bomber engine. The United States built 2 of them. We were involved in an atomic program. In 1961, John Kennedy canceled that program. And to rub salt in the wound, the U.S. Air Force awarded the C-141 transport to Pratt & Whitney. It got to the point where Gerhard Neumann looked at his leadership and just said, I am tired of losing. I'm tired of losing. So what would he do? If you see the little tiny engine below us, the old timers, those are the guys older than me. People of this company, much older than me, will tell you that's the most important engine we ever developed. That's called a G1 demonstrator. It was the building block technology from which a whole generation of new engines for GE would spawn, both commercial and military engines. We had great technologies, we just didn't know how to showcase them together, and that's why this demonstrator was so important. At the same time, if you look at the lift fan on the far right, Gerhard Neumann took a lift fan and turned it 90 degrees on its angle and attached it to a J-79 fighter jet engine and ran it. It was a tremendous success. It's what we now call the first high bypass jet engine. And he took the drawings under his arm and he marched into the U.S. Air Force Research Department in Washington, D.C., laid the drawing across the table and said, this engine will change aviation. It'll be 25% more efficient than any engine ever known to man. And he was right. The TF-39 introduced in 1965 for the C-5 Galaxy would change aviation forever. Now that was a military application, but almost immediately GE was working behind the scenes on how to take that TF-39 technology and return with a vengeance into the commercial world. That would become our CF6 family. Brian Rowe, who you see on the left, was entrusted to be project manager of the CF6 in 1967. He ran that program for several years before he ended up taking over the business. Now, how did the CF6 engine do? Let's just count it off. A300, A310, A330, 747, 767, MD-11, DC-10, DC-10-30, all the military variants, Air Force One. And then in the year 2000, we took the CF6 ADC-2 and we won a contract to re-engine the original C-5. So the baby replaces the father. We also invent the future of flight in this century with some very, very daring technologies, one of those being the GE-NX. Now you look at the picture of Jeannie Rosario on the far right, and the first thought for many of you is going to be, oh, that's GE's first female vice president of engineering. And it's true, but it's not how she sees herself. In talking with her to prepare for this book, she was more interested in talking about what she saw as her greatest achievement and also her greatest headwind. And that was getting the GE-NX ready for prime time. In 2004, with great fanfare, Boeing announced the 787 Dreamliner. And the 3 engine manufacturers were going to compete for a down select down to 2. There were a lot of leaders within GE who said, why don't we just do the GE Pratt Alliance engine together? That takes out the risk, and we'll be down and guaranteed a position on this airplane. And there were key people within General Electric, including a certain guy in this room, who now runs our business, who said, don't you think it's time we finally build a friggin' GE nameplate engine again in Cincinnati? And that was the attitude, and that was the GENX, and it included everything but the kitchen sink. Titanium aluminide in the LPT, an advanced TAPS combustor, which was a huge technology leap in reducing NOx emissions. Let's add to that the highest compression ratio ever for any of our compressors, and a front fan and blades, both made of composite blades with fewer blades. I mean, it was everything but the kitchen sink. And in 2005 was quite a sales bonanza period for the GENX. Over 500 engines are sold for the 787 and for the 747-8. It was the fastest ramp up of a high thrust engine in our history. That same year, Jeannie Rosario, who was vice president of fielded engines, now becomes vice president in charge of new product introductions, and she was to oversee the GENX. And 2 months later, the engine goes to test, and terrible durability, lousy performance. As Jeannie says, it was the wake-up call. Those technologies were not ready for that program. Now, thank God the Boeing 787 was 3 years delayed, because at GE it was all hands on deck. And what happens at GE is when the headwinds get strong and the teams coalesce, that's where the magic happens. And we redesigned the combustor. She worked very closely with Jan Schilling, the chief engineer. She said was her best friend. They redesigned the LPT. Jeannie was very involved in a lot of organizational changes within engineering and manufacturing. And she also had to go to corporate, which she called the confessional meetings, when she would go update the corporation with the team on the GENX and then fight for more money, because not only was the GENX at stake, it was at stake, but also behind the GENX is the LEAP engine. And the core of this engine was going to be on the next narrow body. And the successes they are. And Jeannie, when she talks about this program, you can tell how deeply moved she was by the team spirit at General Electric. She says it's a magic when it occurs. Nobody could beat GE when the team works together. We also see the team spirit uniquely in Lynn with this turboshaft team that's been there forever. You know, I was going to just talk about the T408, which won a critical competition in 2007 on the U.S. Marine heavy lift helicopter, the CH-53K. But really, you can't do it without talking about everything that's happened in that program. If you look in the lower right, you see Jack Parker in the center. He was an imposing leader of this business who doesn't get enough credit. He was one that created the small engine division in Lynn, and their vision was very clear. Helicopters were piston engine, and we're going to replace those all with gas turbine engines. And he announced that we have an engine that's the size of my car engine and 6 times as powerful. It was called the T58. It weighed 250 pounds. It could generate more than 1,000 horsepower, which is a huge accomplishment. Wildly successful program. The Navy liked it so much, they said, we want more power. Bring on the T64. Like the T58, the T64s had this extraordinary run on the CH-53. Think of the T-64 much like your GENX. It's everything but the kitchen sink. Because the Navy gave us this contract, they awarded us a contract for the core of the engine without a specific application, so it could go either turboprop or turboshaft. And so the Lynn team worked for 3 years to prepare a very unique technology for this program. When it entered service in the 1960s, by that point we're in the heart of the Vietnam War, and the applications of helicopters are changing dramatically. And Gerhard Newman gets special permission from the U.S. Army to be embedded with the maintenance crews of his helicopters. Now, Gerhard Newman, being a former maintenance guy himself during World War II, he actually went behind enemy lines and overhauled a Japanese Zero aircraft. They flew it back to Allied safety so they could study it. So this man was a hero. You can imagine the kind of conversations that took place in the jungle. But he came back with an idea. Simplicity is what they need. Simplicity, fewer tools to maintain the helicopter. Now, we all know as engineers, and we all know, and I know as a musician, that to do something simply requires massive, complex expertise in the back and back behind the curtain. And that's what the T700 was all about. That's the helicopter engine that we would introduce in the late 1960s. It was through called the G12 demonstrator. And then by the early 70s, we would win a contract for the T700, and we forecasted that we would sell 5,000 Well, we went maybe 4x beyond that one. So let's go to 2007. There's another competition for a helicopter, and the Lynn team is looking at an opportunity to go even higher in horsepower. And that is for this heavy lift helicopter for the Marines. And the Marines' initial desire was to do commonality with the engine they already had on the V-22, which was a Rolls-powered aircraft. Talk about headwinds. We had a super challenge ahead to win this one. So Russ Sparks, who runs military, and Ed Burtwell, and Harry Nahadas, Scott Donnelly was our president. They all huddled together and said, we are going to give Sikorsky such a piece of technology, we are going to convince them and the Marines it's worth going with us. And that's exactly what they did. In fact, the core of the T408 is based on the GE 27 that goes back to the 1980s. They've worked with this core for decades. They took cooling schemes from the GENX. Remember, everything but the kitchen sink. So cooling schemes, the GENX, are in the T408, and we win this competition also because the Lynn team understands the customer so well. How to store the engines on a carrier, you know, all the maintenance schemes, all the things. They're so embedded with their customers from this long tradition and history. They won this competition, and between 2020 and 2030, the T408 is going to be a great revenue generator for the Lynn operation. And how is the engine doing, by the way? More than 6,500 hours and not a single removal. Now, this is one of my favorite pictures. This is CFM at its best. This is the Dorchester Hotel, July of 2008. And I love the picture for many, many reasons. One is just the sheer team unity between Safran and GE. But look at David Joyce. He's been the CEO all of 2 weeks on that morning, and he's eyeing Bill Clapper in the center seat because they're going to spring a trap on Pratt & Whitney and International Aero Engines. But before I talk further about that, let me give you the conclusion first. This is a crazy statistic. From 2014 to today, we have delivered more than 7,000 CFM 56-7 and -5 engines. These were engines designed in the 1990s, okay? These aren't the new, we're not talking the LEAP, we're talking the traditional CFM engines. More than 7,000 since 2014. In 2016, we delivered over 1,700 of these engines. How could that happen? Well, just look at the picture and I'll tell you how. If you remember the environment in 2008, going to the air show, Boeing and Airbus had not committed yet to a narrow-body aircraft. They were going to wait for the engine makers to commit to more than 15% better fuel burn. Pratt jumps out of the gate and says we have a geared turbofan. And they're creating all kinds of industry buzz with their engine. CFM goes to the air show. They announce the LEAP engine without an application. They announce CFM services where Safran and GE would work together just the way the customers wanted. And third, they would extend the agreement between Safran and GE and the CFM International joint company all the way to 2040. Now, some financial analysts at the time had the nerve to call that a publicity stunt. But guys like Bill Clapper, you see right there, Bill Clapper said, no, that's a broadside against International Aero Engines and Pratt & Whitney. See, they saw a chink in the armor because when this team would go out, and Shaker Sharor and any number of people in this room would know, the airline customers were very aware of the fact that Pratt was pursuing a geared turbofan without its partners within the International Aero Engines Consortium. There was a chink in the armor. And they would ask us, are you guys going to stay together with CFM? And we're like, whoo, I gotcha. So unifying the team was not a publicity stunt. It was one of the best moves we ever made. 2011 comes along, the CFM Summer of Love. This is when we go to the air show in Paris. We sell over 900 LEAP engines for the A320neo. A month later, Shaker Sharor gets the call from Boeing. Says, Shaker, we need to go down to Dallas and talk to American Airlines. Why? Because he was going to provide a maintenance commitment and a fuel burn commitment to secure the LEAP engine as the sole source power plant for the 737 MAX. And we're not over. Then in October, this is when the International Aero Engines Consortium makes a big announcement. Pratt & Whitney, with $1.5 billion, is going to buy out Rolls-Royce's share in the consortium. So what happens? No one at that time could have believed that between the year 2012 and today, Airbus would sell over 900 of the traditional A320s, not the Neos, but the traditional A320s. Now, up until that point, CFM would win usually a little more than 50% of those orders. But with the huge change in that consortium and looking towards CFM that's committed to 2040, over 70% of those engines were selected with CFM over that time. And hence the strategy laid out in 2008 by this team would bring home the dividends all those years later. Now, in writing the book, I tried to find out, well, who was the guy who came up with the idea? Who came up with this idea of the 2040? So I called Bill Clapper, and Bill Clapper said, I really don't want to talk about this, but it was David Joyce. So I sent an email to David Joyce, and David Joyce says, I really don't want to talk about this, but it was Bill Clapper. And this is what I love about this culture. That's what's so unique about the culture, because when the team coalesces, the magic occurs. And this is why GE Aviation is the most successful aviation company in the world today, by any measure. We have a backlog that's the envy of the industry. And we have technologies. I've spent the last 30 minutes just talking about engines. The person replacing me here 100 years from now will be talking about all kinds of things beyond the engine, just the exciting things we're doing here. Now, in our purpose statement, we never mention the word depend, but it's implied. Because just think about it for a second. Think of who depends on this business. The United States military certainly depends on GE Aviation. All of our allies around the world, they all depend on GE Aviation. The French government depends on GE Aviation. The communities in more than 80 sites around the world where our employees not only buy components and goods and services there, but also work in those communities, they all depend on GE Aviation. There's hundreds of airlines that depend on GE Aviation, and that doesn't even count the 250,000 people right now in the sky flying above the clouds so quietly we don't even know they're there, and they're all dependent upon GE Aviation. Now, as I said before, you're probably asking, so am I really the pensioner cheerleader here to speak to you today? Well, the bigger question really is, shouldn't we all be GE Aviation cheerleaders? If I may use a quote from Morgan Freeman from the great movie Shawshank Redemption, damn straight. I'll do it.